Hi everybody. So today we're going to talk about energy consumption with a focus on these 5 learning goals. The first one is that we have this growing dependence on energy, and that's pretty obvious. We've talked about how we see this increase in CO2 over time, and that's related to our increased dependence on energy consumption. We're burning more and more energy over time. There's a lot of nuances to this, though, that we're going to get into, in that energy use is really heterogeneous over space and time. So it varies over time. It also depends on which country you live in. It depends on where you live in that country, and also lots of other factors that we'll look at. We'll look at energy use in the US in particular, and how the choices we make for reducing our energy use can impact the total energy use that we have in the US, and how it's really hard to reduce the amount of energy we have in the US, or we use in the US, just with our own personal choices. And then finally, we'll show you this, I'll show you this cool flow diagram that talks about all the different energy types coming into the US global, or the US like energy economy, and how that energy is actually distributed to different energy sectors. So it's kind of a cool way to end. So I'll show you this picture. This is a picture that you probably all know because you've been on the outside of your homes and you've seen these electric meters that are sitting there, that the Austin Energy has put there, and these measure the amount of energy use that is ongoing inside your home every day, and that energy use is reported back to the city in order to bill you. Now, when I talk about this electrical meter, I want to be clear that we're only talking about electricity here. This is not total energy use. It's just electricity that's delivered. You also use energy like gasoline in your car, and that's a totally different thing. Okay, so this is just residential energy. That kind of energy flow or electricity is typically called a kilowatt hour. Okay, and that's the energy equivalent to 1 kilowatt of power sustained for 1 hour, and this is how you abbreviate it. If you remember, I think I brought this up in an earlier lecture, that 1 joule per second is equal to a watt, and thus 1 kilowatt is going to be 1,000 joules per second, right? So a kilowatt hour then is going to be 1,000 joules per second times 3,600 seconds per hour. And so it's equal to about 3.6 megajoules. So remember, we talked before about how physicists tend to express energy in terms of joules, whereas the economists tend to express energy in terms of calories. Well, this is just a way to look at how a kilowatt hour corresponds to the sort of physical definition of energy generation. So it's equal to about 3.6 megajoules. It's actually quite a bit of energy. And so when we think about a terawatt, a tera is going to be equal to, what is this, like 1 trillion? That's a billion, that's a trillion. 1 trillion times a kilowatt hour. And so it's equal to this value, this 3.6 million joules, or 3.6 megajoules, times a trillion, which I just said is a lot. It's a lot of energy, a terawatt, right? A lot of zeros that go into this. So keep that in mind when you look at this plot. This plot shows the primary energy consumption by region. So we have these different regions. Mostly they're distributed into different continents, so Asia Pacific, North America, Europe and Eurasia, Latin America and the Caribbean, Middle East and Africa. And it shows how much energy is being consumed by each of these regions, and then when you stack them all up, you get the global total energy used by the entire globe. It's just over 140,000 terawatt hours. So going back to this number, we have this value here, 3.6 million times a trillion times 140,000. That's how much energy is being used globally per year. It's a lot of energy. So we can look at how that energy is broken down by these different regions, and we see how each population group has changed in their consumption over time. This only goes back to 1965. There are other plots out there that go back even further, but mostly what they just show is this kind of tailing off of energy consumption to the Industrial Revolution, when we had this big increase in energy use. So in general, we see this global trend of energy consumption increasing worldwide. But if you take this data and normalize it by the total amount of energy used per year, you get a percentage instead, right? So what this is now showing is that these same regions, Asia Pacific, North America, etc., but it's showing a percent of the total energy consumed by this country or this region as a function of the entire amount of global energy that's being consumed. Okay, so it's saying that Asia was using, what is this, like maybe 12% of the total global energy budget in 1965, but look how rapidly that's increased. It's increased to over 40% in 2015. You can also see growths occurring in Africa, the Middle East, and Latin America and the Caribbean. So all of these countries that are developing countries and not fully developed countries are seeing these really rapid increases in energy consumption. They're taking over a much larger percentage of the total global amount of energy being consumed. And in response, right, we see shrinkages in Europe and North America. These are places that are pretty well developed. In North America, in both countries, they were shrinking roughly about from 40% in 1965 to about 20% each in 2015. So these are really big changes over time. When we actually look at this on a per capita basis, so now this is taking the total amount of energy used in each country and dividing it by the population, we see other really stark differences, okay? Global energy use per capita is increasing for most regions. There's a small downturn for some of these countries during the last recession, which I think we talked about in the previous lecture. Most of this growth is driven by increased consumption and transitioning from the middle class or middle income countries to higher class or higher income countries. And so you'll see these really big changes in energy for countries like China, but also a little bit for India, even Egypt to some degree, and Brazil as well. In here, we see these really big increases in the amount of energy used per capita over time for these countries, these developing countries. China, for example, has seen an increase of about 250% since the year 2000. So despite these large increases in energy use per capita for these developing nations and big decreases in energy use for the developed nations, there's still huge global inequities that I want you to see here. In the US, we're using, on average, 80,000 kilowatt hours per person per year. Compare that to China, which has seen this enormous growth. They're still using a fraction of the energy that we are using. So this is just looking at the US since the Industrial Revolution. So it hit the US a little bit later in time, and we see this big increase around 1900 of energy use. During the Great Depression, there was this really big drop in energy use, and similarly, we see the same sort of precipitous drop in the last recession. But this, the overall trend that you can see here is this really large increase over time. During the last 140 years, between 1850 and the year 2000, total energy consumption in the US more than tripled. So it went from about 100 BTUs, this is now that version of kind of calories of energy consumption per capita, to just over 300 BTUs. So in other words, you and I use 3 times as much energy during our lifetimes as someone who lived during the Civil War. So really big changes over time. This is another way to visualize energy consumption per person by country to look at some of these global inequities. So these are colored by this chart down below, and it just shows the millions of British thermal units or BTUs that are being used by these different countries. So a place like Saudi Arabia and Iceland, United States and Canada, Norway, they're using an incredible amount of energy compared to places like Africa. So in general, the average US citizen is using more than 10 times the amount of energy that's being used by people in India, and more than 3 times the amount of energy of people that are in China. This, to a large degree, is driven by our economy. So the gross domestic product we talked about earlier, it's a measure of how much money is generated through goods and services in a country, and here it's divided by the number of people. So it's the GDP per capita, but it's going to be in a dollar amount. Okay, so countries with a high GDP show here that they have also a really high energy use. Energy use is over here on the y-axis. And they've got them color coded by different regions, and then the size of these dots is, I think it's related to population. So we have really big dots for China and India, more small dots for the United States. But what you see is that GDP and energy use are very highly correlated. There's a lot of discussion in the literature about why they are so correlated, and people disagree if GDP drives increases in energy use or if it's increases in energy use that drive the global domestic product to go up. So there's a bit of controversy about this, but regardless, we see this really strong correlation. And that's because of the high potential for energy to improve our living standards, whether that's freeing time from household chores, increasing productivity in different industries, improved healthcare and educational services, or increasing our digital connection to one another. But remember, the GDP is only looking at economic issues. There's this other really interesting metric called this Human Development Index. And this is a metric that the UN, I think the UN developed it, and it's a measure of the quality of human life, the quality of life that people have in these different countries. And so it's dependent upon things like life expectancy, the amount of education people have, and then the prosperity that people see in that country. And so you'd expect that countries that have this really high HDI or Human Development Index would be countries that are fairly happy. You know, the people see a good standard of living in those countries, they feel fairly satisfied. Okay, and you see that those countries that have really high HDIs are also countries that have quite a bit of energy consumption. So there's this really increasing, strongly increasing trend that when you look at an increase in energy use for very poorly developed countries to even just slightly more developed countries, a small increase in energy consumption can lead to huge rapid gains in the Human Development Index. So you invest a little bit in energy production and delivery so that people can have better healthcare and education, you get a really strong return on your investment. However, we see this exponential decline, right? So it grows really rapidly and then it starts to level out. So these countries out here, no matter how much more energy you put into them, you don't really see a big increase in the Human Development Index. You get no better quality of life if you're, say, in Iceland than, say, if you were in Italy. And so a lot of people have argued that we should then keep a threshold on how much energy consumption is actually needed ethically for each country to allow for energy growth in other parts of the world. And some people say that ought to be around, well, here it's in kilograms of oil equivalent per capita, 4,000. I've seen it also as like 4,000 kilowatt hours per person per year as a target. And you'll remember, if we can go back to it, how much is the US in kilowatt hours? Yeah, 80,000 kilowatt hours per capita. So we'd have to reduce quite a bit in order to get down to that 4,000 kilowatt hours per person per year value. We can also look at the same energy consumption data, but break it down in terms of what the energy source is. So here, this is broken down into traditional biofuels, coal, crude oil, and natural gas. These three are our main fossil fuels, our non-renewable fuels. And then we have nuclear, hydropower, solar, wind, and other renewables. So these top ones above nuclear are the renewables. Nuclear is in its kind of other category. It is a non-renewable fuel, but it's less of a fossil fuel or doesn't produce as much of the greenhouse gases like these other like gas, natural gas, crude oil, and coal, and even biofuels to some degree do. So looking over time, again, we see big increases in consumption, but most of that is being driven by increases in fossil fuel use. We have very small increases in renewables that are happening, only about 5 to 6% over the last couple of decades. However, the problem is, if you can see nuclear, it actually hasn't increased at all. In fact, it's nuclear production has decreased by about the same amount that that renewables have increased, and you can kind of see that in this plot here, which is kind of a dumb plot in a way, because it breaks down all the energy production as a percentage now over time by either it's a fossil fuel, or it's a non-fossil fuel. It's a nuclear or renewable. And what you see is that this percentage of nuclear and renewables is more or less steady, around slightly less than 40% over time. So we're really not moving much on reducing our dependency on this green stuff, this fossil fuel, and we can see that here with this big increase in the brown, orange, and yellow parts of this plot. Of course, this differs depending on where you are, right? There are countries like France who depend heavily on nuclear power. Almost 100% of the power and generation in France comes from the nuclear power industry. And you can contrast that with countries like Japan, which had only 30%, roughly the same as Germany, up until about 2011. 2011, for those of you who remember, was when the large Tohoku earthquake struck the coast of Japan. Huge, enormous earthquake. And that caused a really big tsunami that destroyed a number of communities, but also destroyed the Fukushima nuclear power plant, which was right on the coastline and was not protected at all from the tsunami that was produced. And you can see how a number of power plants just shut down after that time, and they're basically down to zero power generation from nuclear energy. So there's a real strong aversion to nuclear power in some places that we will get into when we talk about that in more detail. Within the US, we have this strong dependence on fossil fuels. So now this is looking at each of these different parts of renewable versus non-renewable type of energy, but just in the US. And we can see these large amounts of energy that are being supplied by coal, natural gas, and petroleum, with a really big drop-off in coal that has been taken up by natural gas since about, what is this, maybe like 2010 or so. And this is what our president, Donald Trump, campaigned on, right? He campaigned on bringing back the coal industry. If you look at the energy outlook, this is a projected energy outlook from 2016 onward. They project that coal will not actually be something that will be continued to be mined. And that's because because natural gas is actually really cheap to extract, and we have all the infrastructure now to do so. And so they predict that there'll be big increases in natural gas being supplied as one of our major energy sources, with other renewables also increasing quite a bit, and that we won't actually see an increase back to coal power plants, which I'm actually thankful for. This is kind of an interesting plot. It's a little bit biased, I think. But what it does is it shows you how much energy is consumed within each of the US states, and it compares it to the amount of energy consumed within different countries around the world. And so it shows you things like, Texas is using the most energy in the United States, but it's equivalent to about the amount of energy that is being used by the whole country of Brazil. Same for California. It's a big energy consumer. It's about equivalent to what's being used in all of Mexico, and you can see all these different countries sort of referencing how much of an energy hog each of these states are. It's kind of a funny plot, but I feel like it's a little biased because it's trying to point out that some states are worse than others in a way, and I think it's important to understand that some states act as service sectors for the rest of the country. So if we go back, let's go back actually to California. California is a huge food production state. They grow a ton of vegetables and fruits and nuts that are shipped all across the US and used by almost everybody in the US. And so while they do have a huge amount of energy consumed in that country, and there's a huge population, in that state, and there's a big population in that state, a lot of that is used for the service of the rest of the United States. And the same is true for Texas. So if we look at the amount of energy consumed within Texas by the end use sector, right, it's broken down into these 4 different sectors: industrial, transportation, residential, and commercial. And we see that industrial uses, this is just in 2011, they take up about half of the total consumption. This is pretty unusual compared to other states. And that's because we are a huge center for oil and gas production that is used by the rest of the nation. In 2016 alone, we produced more than a third of the nation's crude oil using 29 refineries. And Texas also produces more than 25% of the natural gas used in the United States, leading all other states. And so when we look at this plot here and we see that Texas is this giant energy hog, well, in part, yes, but a lot of that energy that's being consumed here is to the benefit of the entire United States. So let's look at our energy appetite as individuals. So what do we use all that energy for? Well, we estimate that we use about 340 kilowatts of energy per day. So that's taking a value that I showed you earlier for the total amount that the US uses per year and dividing it by the number of people and by the number of days in a year, okay? So we get to 340 kilowatt hours per day. Now, a barrel of oil is equal to about 1,600 kilowatt hours. So essentially, we go through 1 barrel of oil every 5 days. Now, we don't all use oil to generate all the electricity that we use, and we'll get into that in a minute. But I want you to think about this, that in your day-to-day lives, what you're doing is consuming about a barrel of oil every 5 days per person in the entire United States. These plots show how household energy is used and how that's shifted over time. I kind of like these. Primarily what you see is that a lot of energy is being used for heating. This is just household energy, okay? So heating mostly of the air so that we can live comfortably, but also of water. But you can see this huge decrease in heating energy needs over time. And that's largely because of increased efficiency standards, not just because of efficiency of furnaces, but also efficiency of windows and other insulators within our homes. The thing that you see is that even though these numbers have been reduced quite a bit from 66% to 41%, the total amount of energy that we're using, this is in quadrillion BTUs, is actually pretty unchanged. So even though we're using way less energy to heat our homes, we're making up for that difference by increased air conditioning and a giant increase in the amount of energy we use for appliances and electronics. And most of this is not driven by appliances. You know, the amount of washers and dryers and dishwashers and other small appliances we've had in our homes haven't really changed tremendously over that time. In fact, they've gotten more efficient. Our dishwashers and washers and dryers are becoming more and more efficient over time. What's really changed is this electronics category. In 1978, personal computers were really expensive and you didn't find them in every home. And nowadays, 76% of homes have at least one computer and 35% have multiple computers. In 1978, we typically had just one television, but nowadays we have 2.5 televisions on average in a home, and they're increasing in size. And so the energy consumed with our personal electronics has really dramatically shifted the total energy uses that we see in the average home. So the typical American household uses about 38 kilowatt hours of energy per day. And let's look at a typical bill. This is my energy bill. This is for last November to December. And you can see that Austin Energy actually does kind of a nice thing of calculating exactly how many kilowatt hours per day I am using. Okay, so I'm using 26.4 kilowatt hours per day, and I mentioned that the average is 38 kilowatt hours per day. Part of that reason I'm a little bit lower than average is because I have these solar panels on my house. I'm trying to do my little part. So I use slightly less than typical households, but this value of 26.4 kilowatt hours per day or 38 kilowatt hours per day is still way less than that average value I gave you earlier. Back here, 340 kilowatt hours per day is the American average amount that American uses. So what's going on here? Where's all that extra energy going? Well, we are ignoring a lot of energy sources. So let's bring our household energy consumption of 35 kilowatt hours per day. This is not including all of the energy that's needed to actually deliver energy to our homes, right? We know there's a huge amount of energy lost at in the power plants and energy lost along transmission lines. And so it actually takes about 65 kilowatt hours today just to deliver this 35 that we're using in our homes. We also use a lot of natural gas for heating our homes. So we traditionally don't use electricity. We use natural gas for our furnaces to drive the heating in our homes. For people who live up north compared to Texas, it's a lot more energy use. It's about 35 kilowatt hours traditionally or typically per day. And then we all drive a lot, and this is a huge energy consumption, roughly equivalent to about 100 kilowatt hours per day. And so if we add all of these things up, we get about 235 kilowatt hours per day. This is still far from our 340 estimate. And we have to remember that all of these values here represent sort of household values. And a lot of households have more than one person living in them. In fact, most US households have about 2.5 people or 2.4 people living in each home. And so if we take this value and then divide it by 2.4, we get only 95 kilowatt hours per day. So we're still missing a lot of energy, right? This is just still only about 30% of the total 340 kilowatt hours per day that I mentioned earlier. And so we're neglecting all this hidden energy. This is energy that is used in different industries for our benefit. Things like industry, agriculture, commercial and consumer goods, defense, transportation, government. This is a cool picture of the inside of an Amazon warehouse. I use a ton of Amazon deliveries. I need to stop because it's really convenient, but it's a huge amount of hidden energy. And this energy supports the lifestyles that we enjoy, but we actually don't have a lot of direct control over it. These energy sources, we can say, I'm going to get a more efficient home, I'm going to reduce the temperatures at night, and I'm going to use less fuel. I might have less people in my home too. And so I can control this amount of energy, but it's only 30% of the total. The rest, 70%, is actually being driven by forces outside of our own reach. And so it's incredibly challenging to be able to have any personal choices that impact on such a large scale. So we can also break down energy use by four main sectors. So industrial, transportation, residential, and commercial. And each of these, this is just for the US, shows an increasing trend over time. And there's slight dips in these, these are kind of leveled off recently. And in part, that's because of the last recession. But we don't expect for these values to decrease substantially in the future. We expect that all sectors of the energy will be used in the future. We also know that energy in the US comes from a whole bunch of different sources. Primarily, it's these fossil fuels, a little bit of uranium used in the nuclear power generation, and then a smaller fraction of renewable fuels. Okay? And this is this diagram that shows, it's kind of this complicated flow diagram. But what it shows is all these different energy sources and what they're used for in terms of transportation, all these different energy sectors, residential, commercial, etc. And it's a really cool, but complicated diagram, but it nicely shows how different energy sources are used. So take examples of like petroleum. This is oil and gas. This energy source is primarily used in transportation. There's a little bit used in industry, and we use it in our residential lives, right, to go to the store and back, and commercially they use it for delivering goods. But a lot of it is used in the transportation industry. We don't use a lot of petroleum to generate the electricity that we need in our homes. That actually comes from a whole bunch of different sources, from coal, from natural gas, from all these renewables. They all go into electricity generation, which are provided to both residential, commercial, and industrial sources, as well as some for transportation. And then you can also see this huge amount of rejected energy, and we talked about this last time. This is the inefficiency in the system. So this is all of these different renewables and non-renewable energies going into the power plant, and what you actually get out in terms of energy or electricity generated that can be used by these sectors is only about 40%. The rest is that, or not, that's not a percent, this is in quads, whatever that unit is a smaller amount. I think it was like 35%. And 60% is actually rejected energy. A huge amount is rejected. You can see the differences here. Here's the amount that's actually used, and the rest is actually just rejected. So what I love about this plot is that it shows us where all these different energy sources go into the different sectors. And the other thing is that I want you to have as a takeaway from this is that it's important to see that it's hard for us to transition out of using one type of energy source for another. So a lot of people think, well, why don't we just switch to electric cars instead of depending on oil and gas for our cars? Well, um, that's a possibility. However, we need most of this electricity for the uses that we have. We have so much electricity that's wasted through inefficiencies that we don't probably have enough electricity to supply this entire transportation sector. And on top of that, we've created this entire infrastructure around the entire US of fuel delivery of cars that only take fuel, they don't take electricity, in order to create the kind of system, the economy that we have. To change midstream into a different kind of energy source takes an enormous amount of infrastructure change, which is costly. And so it's not very likely that our entire country will switch from petroleum-driven transportation needs to electrical-driven transportation needs. The other reason for that is because of batteries, right? And I'm not sure, we might get into this when we talk a little bit more about renewables, but you can only store so much energy on a battery. And this is what this shows. So the red is what shows NiCad batteries, or your traditional batteries, compared to lithium-ion batteries, these new batteries that companies like Tesla are creating. And you can see over time that the energy density is increasing quite dramatically from 100 watt hours per kilogram to now almost 250 watt hours per kilogram. So it's basically saying with the same amount of lithium-ion battery, you're getting more energy out of it over time, which is great. You also see the cost of a lithium-ion battery really rapidly decreasing. It's leveling out now, but it's really rapidly decreasing, meaning that the technology can be developed because it's cost effective to do so. But we're still a long way from transitioning entirely from a transportation industry away from one that's dependent on petroleum and into one that could be driven instead by electricity. Okay, so that's really it for today. After this, we're going to start delving into all the different types of energy in more detail.